Somewhere off the coast of a tiny Caribbean island, hundreds of feet below the surface, the largest toothed predator on planet Earth is having a conversation. Not a metaphor, not clickbait exaggeration, actual rhythmic bursts of clicks passed back and forth between sperm whales that scientists using artificial intelligence have now shown follow rules eerily similar to the building blocks of human language. Headlines exploded across the internet claiming scientists had finally cracked whale language, that we were on the verge of actually talking to whales. But here's the part almost nobody explains properly. What researchers actually found is stranger, more careful, and honestly more fascinating than any headline captured. And it is absolutely not the Google Translate for animals that most people assume it is. Stick around, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly what was discovered, what was not, and why serious scientists are both thrilled and deeply cautious about what comes next. To understand why this discovery matters so much, you first need to understand exactly what scientists were listening to. Sperm whales do not sing melodic songs the way humpback whales famously do. Instead, they communicate through short, rapid bursts of clicking sounds called codas, produced by forcing air through specialized structures in their massive heads. A single coda might last only a second or two, made up of just a handful of individual clicks, but sperm whale lets us string these codas together into longer exchanges that can stretch on for many minutes at a time, passed back and forth between individuals, almost like a call and response conversation. For decades, researchers assumed these codas were fairly simple, a small fixed set of patterns whales used mostly to identify their family group or clan, not unlike a regional accent or specific dialect marker. The organization leading this research effort is called Project CETI, short for the Cetacean Translation Initiative, a nonprofit founded in 2020 that grew out of an unlikely meeting of minds at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute back in 2017. A marine biologist named David Gruber, a cryptographer named Shafi Goldwasser, and a computer scientist named Michael Bronstein realized that the tools cryptographers use to crack secret codes, combined with the pattern recognition abilities of modern machine learning, might be powerful enough to finally decode something as complex as whale communication. The project eventually grew into a genuinely massive interdisciplinary collaboration, pulling in more than 15 partner institutions, including Harvard, Oxford, MIT, and the National Geographic Society, along with marine biologists, linguists, roboticists, and artificial intelligence researchers, all working together toward one shared goal. The team set up an enormous underwater recording operation around the island of Dominica, deploying microphones at multiple depths and tagging whales with sensors that could confirm exactly what each animal was doing while it clicked, whether it was diving, resting, breathing at the surface, or socializing with other members of its family group. Over years of painstaking fieldwork, they gathered a genuinely staggering dataset, eventually analyzing more than 8,700 individual coda, recordings collected from roughly 60 different whales. That scale of data is exactly what modern machine learning needs to work its magic, since these algorithms thrive on finding subtle statistical patterns buried inside enormous datasets that would be essentially invisible to a human researcher working by ear alone. In May of 2024, that years-long effort produced its first major breakthrough, published in the prestigious journal Nature Communications. Researchers from MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, working alongside the CTI team, announced they had identified what they called the sperm-whale phonetic alphabet. Using machine learning to comb through those thousands of codas, they discovered the clicks were not simply a small fixed set of rigid, unchanging patterns after all. Instead, whales appeared to be combining a set of basic building blocks, 4 core components in particular, in flexible and context-sensitive ways, adjusting rhythm, tempo, and even adding tiny embellishments. The researchers described using musical terms borrowed from music theory, rubato, and ornamentation, the same words used to describe subtle timing variations a human musician might add to a piece of music. This was already a genuinely significant discovery, since it directly overturned the long-standing assumption that sperm whale codas functioned like a rigid, limited version of Morse code. Instead, the data suggested something closer to a combinatorial system, meaning whales could theoretically combine a relatively small set of basic sound units into an enormous number of different possible sequences, the exact same underlying principle that allows human languages to generate essentially unlimited numbers of different words and sentences from a limited alphabet of sounds. Researcher Pratyusha Sharma, who led much of this analysis, explained that the alphabet could be used by whales in what amounts to an unlimited number of combinations, mirroring precisely how humans combine individual sounds into words and words into full sentences. If discoveries like this genuinely fascinate you, go ahead and tap that like button right now. It really does help more curious people find this video. Then, in November of 2025, the story took an even more remarkable turn. A newer round of analysis, led by CETI's linguistics lead Gasper Begush, a researcher whose background includes studying ancient human languages like Hittite, Tocharian, and Sanskrit, uncovered something even more startling buried within the whale phonetic alphabet. Certain coda types, which researchers labeled I-codas, appeared to function remarkably like vowels do in human speech. Just as human languages often distinguish meaning through subtle differences in vowel length, think of how the English words sheep and ship differ only by that one small vowel sound. Sperm whales appeared to be doing something structurally very similar, producing both long and short versions of these particular clicks in ways that seemed deliberate and potentially meaningful, rather than random or accidental. Begush summarized the significance of this finding by noting that whales appear to have independently evolved a system that behaves in strikingly vowel-like ways, deployed in patterns that echo how vowels function inside human speech, despite sperm whales and humans sharing no recent common ancestor and having evolved completely separate methods of vocal communication across tens of millions of years of divergent evolution. But the single most sophisticated discovery buried inside this newer research involved something linguists call co-articulation, a phenomenon that shows up constantly in human speech, where the sound a person is currently making gets subtly shaped and influenced by whatever sound came immediately before it. Say the word handbag out loud slowly, and notice how the D sound softens and blends into the B that follows it, rather than staying crisp and separate. Researchers found evidence that the very first click inside a sperm whale vowel like coda could be measurably shaped by whatever coda had immediately preceded it, a level of contextual, sequential complexity that had never before been documented in any non-human communication system, and one that stands as one of the clearest hallmarks of genuinely sophisticated language structure anywhere in the animal kingdom. Now here comes the part where we need to slow down considerably, because this is exactly where popular headlines took a genuinely careful, cautious, scientific finding and stretched it into something far more sensational than what actually happened. Despite viral headlines proclaiming that AI had finally translated whale language, that is simply not what occurred here, and it is not remotely close to what CETI's own researchers claim to have achieved. What scientists actually discovered was structure. They found that sperm whale communication follows organized, rule-governed patterns that resemble the underlying architecture of human language. Things like a limited alphabet of basic sound units, combinatorial flexibility, context sensitivity, and even vowel-like distinctions and co-articulation effects. What they have not done, and what nobody currently claims to have done, is figure out what any specific whale click sequence actually means. Discovering that a communication system has grammar is a completely different achievement from being able to translate a specific sentence into English. Think of it this way. If archaeologists uncovered an entirely unknown ancient written language carved into stone tablets, and clever pattern analysis revealed that the symbols clearly followed consistent grammatical rules with recurring word-like units combined in structured, predictable ways, that would be an extraordinary discovery in its own right. But it still would not tell you what any specific inscription actually said, not without something like a Rosetta Stone providing a direct translation key, or an enormous amount of additional contextual work connecting specific symbols to specific real-world meanings. That is essentially where sperm whale research currently stands. Scientists have compelling evidence of structure and sophistication. They do not yet have reliable, verified translations of specific whale conversations, despite what plenty of viral videos and clickbait articles have implied. This distinction matters enormously, and not every scientist in this field is even fully convinced that what has been documented so far definitively qualifies as language in the strict linguistic sense. Luke Rendell, a biologist at the University of St. Andrews who studies sperm whale behavior, has publicly voiced skepticism about how far these findings should really be extended, pointing out that one of the truly defining features of human language is genuine unpredictability. The fact that it is extraordinarily difficult to predict what specific sound or word a human speaker will produce next within a sequence. Whether sperm whale codas display that same fundamental level of open-ended unpredictability, as opposed to more constrained and specialized signaling, remains a genuinely open and actively debated scientific question, not a settled fact, regardless of how confidently some headlines have presented it. There's also a fascinating and somewhat unusual technical detail behind exactly how these AI models are being built and trained, and it matters a lot for understanding why this research is credible rather than simply pattern-matching noise into meaning. Unlike massive general-purpose language models trained on enormous piles of human-generated text scraped from across the internet, the machine learning models CETI uses are deliberately built quite differently. They are fed exclusively on raw sperm whale acoustic data, learning only from the sounds themselves with absolutely no exposure to human words, grammar, or language structure baked into their training process at all. Researchers also intentionally kept these models relatively small and simplified, specifically so that scientists could actually peer inside and directly observe how the algorithm identifies and organizes the patterns it detects, rather than relying on some enormous, incomprehensible black box system that spits out results nobody can meaningfully explain or verify afterward. If this kind of careful, evidence-based science genuinely interests you, hit that subscribe button, because there's a lot more of this coming. So far, using this careful approach, researchers have managed to identify somewhere between 100 and 600 distinct types of sperm-whale codas, an enormous and genuinely surprising jump upward from the far smaller handful of coda types earlier researchers had originally cataloged using more traditional listening-based methods. That expanded catalog lays essential groundwork for future research, specifically aimed at figuring out what individual codas or coda sequences might actually correspond to in terms of real-world meaning. But that harder work of assigning genuine meaning still remains mostly ahead of researchers, rather than safely behind them. This raises a genuinely difficult scientific puzzle that goes beyond just sperm whales specifically. How would you even begin proving that a proposed AI-generated translation of an animal's communication is accurate, when you cannot simply ask the whale directly whether the translation is correct? Researchers affiliated with CETI, including experts from OpenAI, have begun publishing serious theoretical work specifically exploring this exact evaluation problem, proposing statistical methods designed to test whether a candidate translation is more plausible than random, alternative orderings of the same underlying signals, without requiring any kind of direct real-time interaction with the animals themselves. This growing, quite technical subfield, focused purely on how to properly verify animal communication translations, shows just how seriously and cautiously the scientific community is approaching this problem, precisely because the temptation to see meaningful patterns that are not actually there, sometimes called the illusion of communication, is a very real and well-documented risk whenever humans study animal behavior with high hopes attached. There is also a much bigger ethical conversation quietly unfolding alongside all of this exciting technical progress, one that genuinely deserves attention here. If scientists eventually do succeed in reliably decoding meaningful chunks of whale communication, what actually happens next? And who gets to decide how that knowledge gets used? Legal scholars and researchers, including some directly affiliated with CETI itself, have already begun publishing serious academic papers, exploring how a genuine breakthrough in understanding animal communication might eventually influence conservation law, animal welfare policy, and even long-running philosophical debates about which non-human species might deserve some form of legal protection or standing. At the same time, some observers have raised uncomfortable concerns about the flip side of that same coin, since the very same technology capable of helping humans understand and protect whales could theoretically also be misused, for example, to more effectively locate or lure marine animals for exploitative purposes, and currently there are no dedicated international legal protections specifically designed to prevent that kind of misuse from happening. None of these very real caveats make this research any less genuinely remarkable. Quite the opposite, honestly. The actual carefully documented findings here, a flexible combinatorial alphabet, vowel-like distinctions carrying potential meaning, and co-articulation effects showing genuine sequential context. Sensitivity represents some of the strongest evidence ever gathered that a non-human species has independently evolved a communication system, sharing deep structural similarities with human language, despite tens of millions of years of completely separate evolutionary history separating our two lineages. That is an extraordinary scientific finding entirely on its own merits, without needing any exaggeration or embellishment to make it sound impressive. What makes this story genuinely different from typical viral science headlines is precisely the gap between what actually happened and what got reported and shared online. We are not currently anywhere close to slipping on a pair of earbuds and having a casual, real-time conversation with a sperm whale about what it had for lunch, no matter how many dramatic YouTube thumbnails might suggest otherwise. What we do have is something arguably even more scientifically profound in its own right, solid, carefully peer-reviewed evidence that one of the largest brained creatures on this entire planet has been quietly using a sophisticated, structured, rule-governed communication system in the pitch-black depths of the ocean this entire time, patiently waiting for the right combination of technology and human curiosity to finally start noticing. It helps to understand why researchers zeroed in specifically on sperm whales, rather than any of the other roughly 90 cetacean species swimming around in the world's oceans. Part of the answer comes down to raw brain size. Sperm whales possess the largest brain of any animal that has ever existed on Earth. dwarfing even the human brain several times over in raw mass. And while brain size alone does not automatically equal intelligence or language capability, it does make sperm whales an obvious and compelling candidate for testing whether sophisticated communication might be hiding somewhere inside all that neural tissue. Sperm whales also happen to be remarkably social, living in tight-knit, long-term family units called clans, sometimes staying together with the same individuals across an entire lifetime that can stretch beyond 60 years. That kind of stable, long-term social structure is exactly the sort of environment where complex communication would provide a genuine evolutionary advantage, since individuals benefit enormously from being able to coordinate behavior, share information, and maintain relationships across decades of shared history. There is also a more practical reason sperm whales made an ideal test case for this kind of research. Unlike many whale species that communicate using long, complex melodic songs stretched out across many minutes, sperm whale codas are comparatively short, discrete, clearly separated bursts of clicks. That structural simplicity, ironically, makes them considerably easier for both human researchers and machine learning algorithms to isolate, categorize, and analyze systematically, compared to trying to break down a continuous, flowing humpback whale song into discrete component parts. In some ways, sperm whale codas function almost like a naturally occurring real-world Rosetta Stone practice problem, complex enough to potentially reveal genuine language-like structure, but still simple enough in their basic acoustic architecture to make rigorous computational analysis realistically achievable with current technology. The story of David Gruber himself adds an interesting human dimension to this entire scientific effort as well. Long before Project CETI existed in any formal sense, Gruber was already known within the marine biology community as someone willing to pursue genuinely unconventional research questions, including earlier work using specialized camera technology to study how sharks and other marine creatures perceive the world through senses very different from human vision. His fascination with sperm whales specifically began after he read a book about freedivers who spent years studying these animals up close in their natural ocean habitat. And that fascination eventually led to the chance encounter at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute that brought together the unlikely combination of a marine biologist, a cryptographer, and a computer scientist, whose combined expertise would go on to reshape what scientists thought was possible in animal communication research. It is also worth appreciating just how much specialized engineering had to happen before any of this acoustic data could even be collected in the first place. Recording clear, usable audio of sperm whales clicking away hundreds of feet below the ocean's surface, often in complete darkness, required building an entirely custom underwater recording infrastructure specifically for this project. Researchers deployed networks of specialized microphones at multiple depths throughout the whale's natural habitat near Dominica, alongside sophisticated tagging devices attached temporarily to individual whales that could track precise behavioral context, confirming exactly what an animal was doing, whether diving deep in search of prey, resting near the surface, or actively socializing with other members of its family clan at the exact moment each recorded coda was produced. Without that painstaking behavioral context data working alongside the raw acoustic recordings, researchers would have had no reliable way to connect specific communication patterns to specific real-world situations, robbing the entire dataset of much of its scientific value. This broader effort to understand animal communication using artificial intelligence extends well beyond just sperm whales too, and it is worth briefly zooming out to appreciate the wider scientific landscape this research fits inside. Similar computational approaches are currently being applied to study the complex melodic songs of humpback whales, the elaborate vocal repertoires of various primate species, and even somewhat more controversially, the communication systems of elephants whose deep infrasonic rumbles carry information across many kilometers of open savanna. Not all of these parallel research efforts enjoy the same level of scientific rigor or peer-reviewed credibility that Project CETI has worked hard to build for itself, and this broader field has occasionally attracted attention from less careful commercial ventures eager to make premature or exaggerated claims about achieving genuine interspecies translation. Promises that serious researchers in this space tend to view with considerable and justified skepticism. That contrast actually helps explain why Project CETI's own careful, incremental, heavily peer-reviewed approach deserves genuine credit and respect, even though it inevitably makes for less dramatic headlines than sensational claims about talking whales. Real scientific progress in an area that's genuinely difficult tends to happen in careful, well-documented, thoroughly verified increments rather than sudden dramatic breakthroughs. And the researchers involved in this work have been consistently transparent in their own published papers and public statements about exactly what they have solidly established so far versus what still remains an open, actively unresolved question requiring considerably more research before any confident conclusions can reasonably be drawn. Looking ahead, the next major phase of this ongoing research effort will likely focus heavily on trying to connect specific coda, patterns and sequences to specific observed whale behaviors and social contexts, gradually building toward the kind of grounded, evidence-based translation work that could eventually move this field beyond simply describing structure and toward genuinely understanding meaning. That is an enormously difficult scientific challenge, arguably one of the hardest problems in the entire field of animal behavior research, but the foundational groundwork laid by identifying this sophisticated phonetic alphabet, these vowel-like distinctions, and this genuinely startling co-articulation effect represents real, substantial, and carefully verified progress toward that much larger and more ambitious goal. Whatever comes next in this remarkable scientific story, one thing has already become abundantly clear. The ocean has been considerably louder and considerably more complex this entire time than humanity ever fully appreciated, and we are only now, through the careful combination of dedicated field science and modern artificial intelligence, finally beginning to listen closely enough to notice.